Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Crimea, with Black Sea, with the south of Ukraine. During the previous night, the Ukrainians made massive drone swarm attack against this island, and they used more than 30 drones for that purposes. All of those drones were shot down and destroyed by the Russians, and as an act of revenge, the Russians attacked with all type of weapons they have, with missiles, with drones, the port settlements like Odessa and Nikolaev. Later during the day, the Russians published the video of that attack, how their ship was launching missiles, and the Russians were attacking those settlements, not just drones and caliber missiles. Also Odessa, for example, was attacked by Kinjal missile as well. And today some Ukrainian civilians managed to record the result of attack of missile with dagger missile. You saw the explosion, you see this missile, and then we see the result of that attack. Furthermore, other sources published a lot of videos from the settlement itself, the explosions, the fire, and so on. Basically, we can say that Odessa port and Nikolaev port are under blockade. The Ukrainians don't have possibilities from now on to use these ports for any purposes. For example, Zelensky started some negotiations with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, and the head of the United Nations Organization, trying to create their own deal without the Russians, and the Russians from their side started their own negotiations with Turkey about their way of analog of a grain deal. As I understand, nobody is going to sign any agreements with Zelensky because it's highly unlikely that anybody will use Odessa port because of the fact that this port is always under very heavy fire. And not about this, the most important, that I don't think that any insurance company is going to sign any contracts with any ship company about this grain situation and so on. Now let's move to the ground and let's start discussing the situation in Kherson area. The Ukrainians, probably for the first time during the previous months, took a decision to use Bayraktars in Kherson area. On this video, on these photos, we see that the Russians managed to shut down Bayraktars, and the Russians were very surprised, pretty surprised with that behavior of the Ukrainians, because the previous few months, maybe more than half a year, maybe a year, the Ukrainians were using Bayraktars just as reconnaissance forces. And as you can see, according to these photos, the Ukrainians took a decision to load some missiles on board of that drones, and probably they were planning to attack Russian positions, but the Russians managed to discover and to destroy Ukrainian Bayraktar. From the other side, the Ukrainians continue bombing and shelling the south part of Kherson area. On this video, we see how the Russians were trying to hide their armored vehicles between the trees, but the Ukrainians managed to discover Russian forces and to attack them with artillery system. As a result of that attack, as we can see, some armored Russian vehicles were damaged and probably destroyed. Furthermore, the Russians published the video of continuing attacking against the Ukrainian positions at Antonov Bridge. The Russians, as we discussed, took a decision to step back from this area because of probably very high risk of heavy losses. And they understood that, analyzed the situation, understood that there is no reason to control this territory. Neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians are able to develop the bridgehead in the vicinity of this area. So that's why the Russians took place to step back, but the Ukrainians tried to hold some media victory. They tried to show any results, so that's why they continue sending more and more forces, and the more and more forces are under really very heavy fire of the Russian drones and artillery systems, of course. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of fierce fightings at Antonov Bridge and Kherson area, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. Furthermore, the Russians reported that they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian headquarters that located on the north of Kherson area, somewhere in front of Energodar and Zaporizhzhia power plant. That was the headquarters. For now, it's pretty difficult to understand which forces that was the headquarters. But anyway, even though there were no updates, video confirmations, or any numbers from the Russian side about the result of that attack. Now we are moving to Zaporizhzhia area. We haven't received any video or photo confirmations from Petsikhatki, from Lapkovo, from this area. As I understand, after fierce fightings that took place during the previous days, the Ukrainians took a decision to make small regrouping, or to take small operational pause. We know the Russians are not attacking. They have complete defense state. As I understand, the Russians are not planning to attack in the future. So everything for now plays in Russian favor. The time goes in Russian favor. Now we are moving to the Bradley Square. Today we had a lot of updates from this bridgehead. According to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians took a decision to start and to change their focus and to start development of the bridgehead to the west, because a few days the previous week the Ukrainians were completely focused in developing their bridgehead to the southeast and to the east, and as a result of those suicide operations, the Ukrainians managed to develop the bridgehead, managed to capture the trenches, the front lines, the fortifications and the strongholds, and the Russians published another video of results of those clashes. A lot of Ukrainians armored vehicles were destroyed, but for example on this video we see how the Russians destroy empty armored vehicles. That wasn't the armored vehicle that with infantry or so on. Mainly the Ukrainians, when they reach the combat line, they leave these armored vehicles because they understand that this is the most tasty piece of cake for the Russians, and they try to hide and try to establish their positions along the trenches, and the Russians destroy the armored vehicles on the fields. Sometimes they're attacking the same armored vehicles because they're just standing on the ground between the fields. And also we know that Ukrainians of this offensive operation mainly tried to use this road to get as close as possible their forces to the combat line. Then they're stretching their forces among these fields, and the Russians, they understand that this road is the very important for the Ukrainians, and the Russians do have their positions very close to this area. So that's why almost every single day we receive more and more videos of another fire control over this road, and the Russians almost every single day destroy another armored Ukrainian vehicle. And today we got another video how the Russians managed to discover and to destroy another armored Ukrainian vehicles and this interception of the forest lines, and as a result of artillery fire they managed to destroy a few armored vehicles and Ukrainian forces on this bridgehead. So, and this is exactly the reason why the Ukrainians took a decision within the next few days to try to make some attempts to develop the bridgehead to the west but not to the east, because the Russians are too close to their main road and they need to force the Russians to step back. And currently this is the main focus of the Ukrainians and the main purpose of the next few days of attacks. They need to push the Russians to step back, at least from this bridgehead, which will allow the Ukrainians to improve their positions and to reduce their losses during, let's say, rotation along this supply road. Now we are moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We also haven't received a lot of updates from this sector. The Russians published just a few videos how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainians during the previous days of clashes. Probably some episodes on this video took place maybe today or maybe yesterday. Anyway, we see that the front line has been stabilized as well. After failed attempt from the Ukrainian side to attack Staromayorskaya, when they were defeated, the Ukrainians also took a decision to make small operational pause, probably, and there are very high chances that the Ukrainian commanders realized and understood the risks that currently were coming from Kupiansk front line and Lyman front line, and probably the situation on the northern front lines forced the Ukrainians to send some reinforcements to that sector. So that's why the Ukrainians took a decision to make a small operational pause, because currently they don't have enough of power, enough of manpower, armored vehicles to continue offensive operation until they are able to stabilize the situation on the Kupiansk and Lyman front lines. A very interesting geolocated video we got from Novomayorsk, from the north of Novomayorsk, that basically confirms the front line, the combat line in this area. The Russians published the video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in this sector, basically, I'll repeat myself, confirming the real combat line in this area. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Kupiansk, on the Zaporizhzhia and South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles and 1 tank. Now, probably we are moving to the most interesting part of the combat line of the front line. We are going to talk about Donetsk area, and we are going to discuss the Russian attempt of offensive operation in direction of Krasnohorivka. This operation took place on the 16th of July, and currently this operation still continues. The Russians managed to establish control over this stronghold. They got as close as possible to Krasnohorivka, and we got a lot of videos of that, a lot of reports from the Russian sources, but the story is not so beautiful and not so easy as we saw in the Russian segment of internet. Before the Russians launched that offensive operation to the north, and mainly the Russians were using armored fists and armored forces for that purposes, the Russians were attacking in this direction, and before that attack, the Russians launched massive artillery preparation, and they launched massive hunting for the Ukrainian artillery forces of 55th Artillery Brigade that located on the western part of this area. As a result of those artillery duels and those artillery huntings, the Russians managed to destroy a lot of hidden artillery positions of the Ukrainian forces, and on these videos we see the results of those hunting, how the Russians were destroying and attacking the Ukrainian positions among the forest lines, and the Ukrainians used to use these positions to attack the Russians in Marinka and Krasnohorivka, in the vicinity of Pobeda and Stara Mikhailovka. So after successful artillery preparation, artillery counter duels, the Russians launched significant attack using massive waves, massive number of armored vehicles and tanks in direction of that stronghold. Of course, before that, the Russians demined this area using the demining equipment, and they captured that stronghold. And after that, we haven't received any videos from this area. And starting from today, on the 18th of July, the Ukrainian sources started publishing their own version of that offensive operation from the Russian side. The first video we got is dated on the 17th of July. The Ukrainians were controlling and tracking this stronghold, and they were bombing and shelling this stronghold heavily using all types of artillery systems they have. Later, also today, the Ukrainians published another series episodes of battle of that settlement, and on this video we see how the Russians, for example, on this video we see how the Russian troopers were stepping back from destroyed tank that was damaged by the Ukrainian artillery system. So basically there were not just one wave of attack, but few waves of attacks, and some of those waves of attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians, but after another wave, the Ukrainians were defeated in this stronghold and probably were forced to step back. During the night, the Ukrainians, after the Russians captured that stronghold, during the night the Ukrainians were trying to force the Russians to step back, and they were bombing and shelling the troopers in this area with grenades, and they were attacking this area with artillery systems. So as you can see, currently the situation is very difficult for the Russians. We haven't received any reports that the Russians, as a result of that attack, were forced to step back. Currently they control the stronghold, but the question is how long the Russians can control this stronghold, and what kind of actions and things the Russians need to do to improve their positions in this area. According to the video we saw about the Russian offensive operation, the Russians were using these fields, and this red arrow show us the real direction of Russian movements on this sector, on this bridgehead. So that means that the Russians don't have any, let's say, connections with this stronghold along the forest line that goes on the east of this sector. So basically now the Russians need to find a solution how to connect this stronghold with the mainland, because if they are not able to do this within the next few days, the Ukrainian artillery will just reduce this area till ruins, and after that they will launch their own counter-offensive operation, and the Russians basically will be forced to step back. The Russians don't have much time. They have 2-3 days, and they need to improve the supply road, support road. They need to build trenches. They need to connect this stronghold with the mainland. And if the Russians are able to do this within the next few days, then the Russians will be able to establish fire and physical control, mainly fire control over the supply roads that goes from Krasnohorivka to the north of Marinka, and this is very important. And also the Russians will be able to establish fire control over the southern part of Krasnohorivka as well. And for example, if you remember, during the previous week, the Ukrainians launched their own offensive operation along the railroad ways, and at least the Western sources are saying that as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians managed to develop their bridgehead along the railroad ways and probably managed to establish control over this part of the forest line and the railroad ways. And if the Russians, one more time, are able to hold this territory, they will cut and establish real fire control over the Krasnohorivka, and of course it will ease the situation of Russian offensive forces in Marinka. And of course, as soon as the Russians are able to connect this stronghold with the mainland, they will be able to start developing their bridgehead to the west and to establish control over the fields between Marinka and Krasnohorivka. Of course, this situation is perfect. This situation is a real window of opportunities and the window of solving finally the situation with Marinka. The problem is there is just one problem, that Ukrainians, they're not counting their artillery systems or shells, they're not counting anything, they're bombing and shelling this stronghold 24 hours. And now we'll see whether the Russian artillery forces are able to show us effective counter-artillery drills, and if the Russian artillery forces are able to suppress the Ukrainian drone forces and artillery forces as well. Now we're moving further to Klishchiivka, to this area. We haven't received a lot of updates from this bridgehead as well. The Ukrainians published another video how they managed to discover and destroy Russian ammo depot in the vicinity of Kadema. The Russians were using this area to hide their artillery system. Maybe there was some kind of ammo depot and so on. The Ukrainians managed to discover this area, to track the movements, relocation of Russian forces, and after that they destroyed that ammo depot. Of course, this action had just one purpose: to reduce the Russian possibilities in the vicinity of Klishchiivka stronghold. The Russians from their side published video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions along the trenches, along the channel. So as you can see, after a few days or even weeks of Ukrainian active offensive operation in the direction of Klishchiivka, we see that the front line has been stabilized in this area, and currently we see just regular and classical artillery duels between the Ukrainian and the Russian forces. But the problem is that the Russians control the railroad ways, lakes, settlement, forest, and the Ukrainians controls just the fields. And anyway, sooner or later, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back under the pressure of Russian artillery systems. And one more time, the Ukrainians, according to the Russian sources, significantly increased the level of usage of cluster munition, and particularly in the vicinity of Klishchiivka. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fighting on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 400 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 9 artillery systems. As I understand, mainly those losses were connected with the clashes of Krasnohorivka and the clashes in the vicinity of Klishchiivka. Now we're moving to the north. We're moving to the Siversk bridgehead. I believe that today is one of the days, one of maybe of 2 or 3 days during the previous 3 weeks, when the 10 Mountain Assault Brigade of Ukrainian forces haven't published a single video of another episode of bombing and shelling the Russian positions in the vicinity of Berestova and Bilogorovka. Maybe the Russians managed to solve this issue and somehow find a solution how to counterattack the Ukrainian 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, especially their drone forces. But for now, the situation is stabilized and pretty calm in this area. At least we haven't received any video or photo confirmation of any clashes on this bridgehead. The Ukrainians just published the video how they were using the drone, they attacked the Russian heavy mortar system 2S4 Tulpan. This is the heaviest mortar system in the world. They are using the 240mm shells. So this mortar system the Russians are using for just reducing the enemy strongholds. And when talking about this bridgehead, the Russians lost one of those artillery systems as a result of drone attack. But that was not the only Tulpan mortar system that the Russians lost during the previous days on this bridgehead. From the other side, the Russians published the video how they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian positions on the south of Serebryanka forest. We know that currently the Russians are trying to storm the Ukrainian forces on Tarskoye salient, and the Ukrainians probably they knew about those Russian plans, and a long time ago, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, they have already redeployed at least 3 artillery brigades to this bridgehead. There are 26th Artillery Brigade, there are 45th Artillery Brigade and 40th Artillery Brigade. There are a lot of artillery systems, and the main purpose of these artillery systems is to support and to attack Russian offensive forces, to support defense forces, to attack the Russian positions in the area between Yakovlevka and Bilogorovka. So the Ukrainians knew something, and now they're trying to use this probably even superiority in artillery systems on this bridgehead, because for now I don't have any piece of information regarding the Russian artillery forces that were redeployed in this area. When talking about the entire situation on the ground on the Tarskoye salient, we haven't received any updates, any piece of news regarding any attempts from the Russian side to develop the bridgehead in this salient. So as I understand, after a few days of very fierce fightings, both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, took a decision to make a small operational pause for regrouping, for recharging, and in a day or two I believe the Russians or the Ukrainians will restart their offensive or counter-offensive operation. Very interesting updates are coming from Karmazynivka bridgehead. This is the second area where this is the first area, first of all, where the Russians managed to cross the Zheribets river and to establish bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the river. And today we got very interesting video, but the author, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have provided the update whose attack we see on the screen. But this video is geolocated, and we see how some soldiers were trying to attack and to storm this small forest, and on the background we see the artillery, how some forces were bombing and shelling. I believe that the Russians were bombing and shelling those fields, and then we see another platoon or squad of soldiers attacking, firing in direction of forest and moving in direction to the north in direction of the first group. I think that this is the video of Russian attempt to storm and to attack this Ukrainian stronghold in this forest and this small forest belt. First of all, I made such conclusions because those forces were attacking in two directions. That was the first direction of attack on the north of this forest line, and in the second chapter of that video we saw another wave of attack along these fields, and that attack was made by soldiers without support of armored vehicles. So as I understand, because of the fact that there is a river Zheribets, and I believe that it's very difficult to redeploy a lot of armored vehicles on this bank of the river, so that's why the Russians took a decision to attack this forest and this Ukrainian stronghold just with the help of infantry and troopers and the support of artillery. For now we still haven't received any results about those clashes, whether the Russians were able to capture this stronghold or not, but Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt somewhere on Kupiansk direction and to get more territory under their control. So maybe the Russians were talking about this area. For now it's very difficult to understand because there are not many updates and there are not many pieces of information about this situation. Now we're moving to Novoselivske bridgehead, where according to Russian sources, the Russians managed to capture this settlement second time during the previous 2 weeks, and probably for now, at least we got, at least Military Summer Channel found some geolocated video that maybe confirms that the Russians managed finally to capture the entire settlement and to get the western position, western edge of this settlement. But before that, the Ukrainians published the video how using drones they were attacking and bombing Russian supplies, logistics centers. For example, in this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian fuel depot, and after that the drones started bombing and shelling that fuel depot, and we understand, of course, with one purpose, to slow down and to reduce the Russian offensive capabilities. And another attack took place on the north. On this video we see how the Ukrainian drone also were dropping grenades in front of Russian infantry and troopers who were heading from the south to the north in direction of Novoselivske. As you can see on this video, the Ukrainians managed to track the Russian forces, and there was a small ambush, and he dropped a grenade, and then there was a very heavy explosion. But of course, these two videos don't confirm the Russian progress and control over Novoselivske, and there was another video of that. The Ukrainians, as I understand, the Ukrainians were using the demining weapon Zmei Gorynich to demine the area, but it was not demining. Basically, the Ukrainians were attacking, let's say, the western edge of Novoselivske, as I understand, to slow down the Russian infantry who were moving along the streets in direction of the western edge of that settlement. So as you can see, the Ukrainian armored vehicle was located in this area right here, and using the weapon this vehicle had, the Ukrainians attacked the western edge of the settlement, and after that the armored vehicle retreated to the west towards the Ukrainian position. So basically this is the only video evidence that we have that confirms that the Russians managed to reach the western outskirts of this settlement. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Lyman front line, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. And now we're coming to the Kupiansk front line. We got also a lot of updates from this bridgehead. Also, the Russian sources reported, to be more precise, the soldiers and officers of the 6th Russian army reported they managed to develop and to attack and to advance and to take another 3 kilometers on the west from Lyman I in direction of Kupiansk. So basically this is Lyman I, this is direction of the west, and according to that piece of information, the Russians managed to develop their bridgehead for another 3 kilometers, so they managed to reach, get somewhere here. It's very difficult to understand, but this is the updates we have about this territory, about this sector. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. Now we are moving to very interesting updates that we got from Belarus. Today we got another portion of videos of more convoys moving along the roads, among the roads of Republic of Belarus in direction of Osipovichy. And this is another Wagner convoy, and this is the 5th Wagner convoy, and the sources are saying that there were more than 80 trucks and automobiles that were moving between the roads of Republic of Belarus in direction of Osipovichy. So there have been already 5 convoys that were heading in direction of the camps that were prepared and built on the territory of Belarus. Furthermore, the local authorities, the local parliament has adopted necessary laws regarding the regulation of relations between the government and private military campaigns. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.